The gym lights felt like interrogation lamps when Coach Miller called my name and told me to sit. No explanation, no warning, just a hand gesture toward the bench while the scout from UCLA sat 3 rows up, clipboard ready. I'd been starting point guard for 3 years, averaging 22 points and 8 assists. And now I was watching Chad Miller warm up in my spot, stumbling through a layup drill I'd mastered when I was 12. The crowd didn't understand it either. Whispers rippled through the bleachers like wind through tall grass. My jersey felt heavy, useless, a costume I was wearing for a play I wasn't allowed to perform in. Chad's name echoed through the speakers as the starting lineup was announced, and I watched my mother's face in the stands collapse into something between confusion and heartbreak. My name is Darius Carter, and this is my revenge story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. She'd taken an extra shift to buy me new sneakers last week, the kind the college players wore, and now they sat pristine and pointless under the bench. Coach Miller didn't look at me once during the national anthem, but I saw him clap his nephew on the shoulder, whispering something that made Chad grin. The referee's whistle cut through the air, the game started, and I sat there feeling like I'd been erased. Chad threw up 3 air balls in the first quarter, and the scout wrote something down that made my stomach turn. I knew what it looked like I'd lost my spot because I wasn't good enough anymore, like I'd gotten worse instead of better, like everything I'd worked for since 6th grade was just a story I'd told myself. The crowd started chanting Chad's name when he finally made a layup in garbage time, and I felt something inside me go cold and quiet. This wasn't about basketball anymore. This was about a man stealing my future to build his nephews. Miller had been my coach since freshman year, had told me I reminded him of the players he'd seen go pro, had promised to make calls when the time came. Now he wouldn't even make eye contact. I sat through all 4 quarters watching my replacement struggle, watching the scout pack up his things at halftime, watching my mother try to smile when it was clear she wanted to cry. When the final buzzer sounded and we'd lost by 18, Coach Miller gathered everyone in the locker room and talked about building chemistry and long-term development. He still didn't look at me. I walked out of that gym knowing 2 things with absolute certainty. My senior year was supposed to be my showcase, and someone had just stolen the show. The parking lot was almost empty when I finally left, just a few cars scattered under the fluorescent lights. My mother was waiting in our old Camry, heat running to fight off the February cold. She didn't ask what happened, didn't try to fix it with words. She just squeezed my hand and started driving home. I stared out the window at the town I'd grown up in, the same streets I'd run drills on since I was tall enough to palm a ball, and wondered how it had all turned so wrong so fast. Home felt smaller that night, the walls pressing in like they knew what I'd lost. My mother sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, counting bills under the yellow light that made everything look tired and old. She told me to keep my head up, that God had a plan, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd heard too many promises break. The scholarship offers I'd been chasing weren't just about basketball. They were about her not working doubles anymore, about my little sister Nia getting her braces, about finally fixing the water heater that had been cold for 2 months. I went to my room and checked my email for the 15th time, hoping for something from the recruiters I'd been talking to all season. The inbox stayed empty except for spam and a college fair invitation I couldn't afford to attend. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Chad's sloppy footwork and heard the crowd cheering for mediocrity. My phone buzzed around midnight, a text from my teammate Jerome. "That was messed up, bro. Everybody knows." I appreciated it, but appreciation doesn't change scoreboards or fill out scholarship applications. Morning came with the sound of my mother's car starting for another shift, and I lay there wondering if talent mattered at all when someone else controlled the spotlight. Nia knocked on my door around 7, asking if I was okay, and I told her what I'd been telling myself, that it was just one game, that things would work out. But she was 13 and smart enough to hear the lie underneath. I made breakfast and checked my phone again. Still nothing from Oregon. I pulled up the email thread we'd had going. Coach Reeves had been asking about my stats, my GPA, whether I'd consider a visit in March. 3 weeks of back and forth, building toward something real. Now, silence. I sent a follow-up message trying not to sound desperate, asking if he'd gotten my last email about the playoff schedule. The message sat there delivered, but unread. I knew what had happened. Scouts talk to each other, share notes, compare intel. Word had spread that I'd been benched. They didn't know why, just knew that a senior who'd been starting for 3 years was suddenly riding pine. School that Monday felt like walking through water. Everywhere I went, people stared or looked away too fast. Some teammates gave me sympathetic nods in the hallway, but nobody said anything out loud. Chad walked around like he'd earned something, chest out, laughing too loud with his friends. I saw him in the cafeteria wearing my number jersey, the one they sold in the school store with player names on the back. He'd gotten his own made up over the weekend. I sat with Jerome and a couple other guys, pushing food around my tray. Jerome said Coach had been asking about me in practice that morning, wondering if I had attitude problems he should know about. The ground was shifting under my feet. I spent lunch period in the library pulling up game footage from last season. Watched myself run the floor, hit threes, thread passes through defenders like I could see the future. That player was still in me. Nothing had changed except who was deciding when I got to show it. The bell rang, and I headed to English class, sat in the back, tried to focus on whatever Mrs. Patterson was saying about Invisible Man. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone vibrated during class. I checked it under the desk, heart jumping. It was an email notification. I opened it quick, hands shaking. The recruiter from Oregon had finally responded. The email was short and cold, the kind of professional courtesy that sounds polite but means goodbye. Coach Reeves thanked me for my interest, said they'd decided to focus on other prospects, wished me luck with my senior season. No explanation, no details, just a door closing in my face. I read it 3 times in the bathroom stall after class, trying to find some other meaning in the words. There wasn't one. I'd lost Oregon before I even knew I was losing it. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Classes blurred together, hallway conversations became white noise. By the time practice rolled around, I felt hollowed out, running on nothing but muscle memory and spite. Coach Miller didn't acknowledge me when I walked into the gym. The team was already running warm-ups, Chad at the front leading stretches like he'd been captain his whole life. I dropped my bag and joined the line, following the routine I'd done 1,000 times. We ran through defensive drills first, slides, closeouts, help rotations. I worked hard, stayed focused, did everything right. Miller barely looked my way. When we moved to offensive sets, he pulled Chad aside and started walking him through plays frame by frame, hands on his shoulders, voice patient and encouraging. I'd never gotten coaching like that. Miller had always just expected me to figure it out. After an hour, Coach blew the whistle and dismissed us. Most of the team headed for the locker room, but I noticed the gym lights stayed on. I pretended to tie my shoe, watching from the corner of my eye. Chad and Coach Miller stayed behind, setting up cones for a private shooting session. This wasn't new. I'd seen them doing extra work together for weeks now. But today, I decided to stay. I walked over casual, grabbed a ball from the rack. Coach Miller finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was annoyance, not surprise. I asked if I could join the shooting drills, keep my skills sharp. His jaw tightened. He said Chad needed focused development time and I should go home and rest. The dismissal stung worse than being benched. I stood there for a second, ball in my hands, waiting to see if he'd realize what he was doing. He didn't. He turned back to Chad and started setting up the drill. I walked to the locker room feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but clarity. This wasn't about team chemistry or long-term development. This was personal. This was family taking care of family, and I was just in the way. I showered, changed, walked out to the parking lot. My mother was running late, so I sat on the curb watching the sun drop behind the school building. Jerome came out 20 minutes later, saw me sitting there, hesitated. Then he walked over and sat down next to me without saying anything. We stayed like that for a while, just 2 guys watching cars pull out of the lot. Finally, he asked if I was okay, and I told him the truth. I didn't know yet. He nodded, seemed to understand. Then he said something that made my blood stop. He said Coach Miller had been bragging in the teacher's lounge about getting Chad recruited, about how his nephew was going to carry on the Miller basketball legacy. Said he'd heard it from his aunt who taught chemistry. Jerome looked at me when he said it, and I saw he felt bad for me. I thanked him, and he left. I sat there alone as the parking lot emptied out, as the sky turned purple, then black. My mother finally pulled up, apologizing for being late. A patient had crashed and she couldn't leave. I told her it was fine and we drove home in silence. That night I couldn't sleep again, but this time it wasn't about sadness or confusion. This time I was thinking, planning, trying to figure out how to fight something I couldn't punch. Around 2 a.m, I grabbed my laptop and started searching. I needed proof of what was happening. I needed people to see what I was seeing. I found the school's athletic department website and clicked through to the basketball page, looking for highlight reels from recent games. The highlight reel from last Friday's game was posted under Player Spotlights. I clicked it, already knowing what I'd find but needing to see it anyway. The video was 4 minutes of Chad Miller making plays I'd never seen him make in practice. Crossovers, pull-up jumpers, defensive stops that looked textbook perfect. Except I'd been at that game. I'd sat on the bench and watched every possession. Half these clips weren't from Friday. Some were from games 2 years ago when I was a sophomore. I recognized the jerseys, the opponents, even the specific plays. I paused on a three-pointer that was definitely mine. I remembered the setup, the screen, the way the ball felt leaving my hands. The video had Chad's number edited over the jersey. My hands shook on the keyboard. This wasn't just benching me. This was erasing me. I downloaded the video, then went back through the athletic site looking for more. Found 3 other highlight reels from the past month, all featuring Chad, all using footage I knew wasn't his. Some of it was so obvious it hurt. There was a clip where you could see my face for a split second before a quick cut. They'd literally stolen my game film and put his name on it. I took screenshots, saved everything to a folder on my desktop. Evidence. Then I closed the laptop and stared at my ceiling until sunrise, mind racing with what this meant and what I should do about it. School the next day, I walked straight to Coach Miller's office during morning break. He was sitting at his desk reviewing practice plans, coffee steaming next to a framed photo of him and Chad at some basketball camp. I didn't knock, just walked in. He looked up, surprised, then irritated. I asked him directly why my footage was being used in Chad's highlight reels. His face went through several emotions fast: confusion, recognition, then something like calculation. He leaned back in his chair and said, I must be mistaken, that all the footage was properly labeled. I told him I'd downloaded the videos, could show him exactly which clips were which. He stood up then, and his whole demeanor changed. His voice got quiet and hard, the way men sound when they're about to say something they've been thinking for a while. He said I'd been having attitude problems lately, showing up to practice with negative energy, undermining team morale. Said he'd been patient with me, but my jealousy of Chad's development was becoming a distraction. I felt the ground shift again. He was building a story, creating a version of events where I was the problem. I told him that wasn't true, that I'd worked harder than anyone on that team for 3 years. He cut me off, said maybe I needed time to adjust my perspective, that he was suspending me from practice until I could commit to being a team player. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes total. I walked out of his office suspended, branded as having a bad attitude, and holding proof of fraud that apparently didn't matter. Word spread fast. By lunch, the whole school knew I'd been kicked off the team. The story Miller was telling painted me as bitter, jealous, unable to accept a lesser role. Nobody asked my side. Nobody questioned why a 3-year starter would suddenly develop attitude problems right when the coach's nephew showed up. I sat in the cafeteria alone, watching Chad hold court with my former teammates, and felt completely isolated. Jerome found me after school, handed me a USB drive, and walked away before I could ask what it was. I caught his eye across the parking lot and he just shook his head slightly, a warning to be careful. I waited until I got home to plug it in. The drive had a folder labeled Raw Practice Footage with dates going back 2 months. I opened the first file and saw unedited video from practice. Full run-throughs with timestamps, no cuts, no edits. Just pure documentation of what actually happened on the court. I watched myself outplay Chad in every single drill. Watched him miss shots I made, lose defensive assignments I locked down, turn the ball over while I ran clean possessions. Then I watched Coach Miller afterward, sitting at his computer in the office editing that same footage. I could see his screen reflected in the window behind him. He was cutting out my makes, splicing in Chad's few successful plays, building a false narrative one clip at a time. Jerome must have set up a camera somewhere hidden, must have been recording for weeks. The timestamps showed he'd been doing this since January, right after Chad transferred to our school. I had everything now. Every lie, every manipulation, every stolen moment. I sat back in my chair and felt my heartbeat slow down, steady. The question wasn't whether I had proof anymore. The question was what I was going to do with it. I spent the next 3 days watching every file on that USB drive, taking notes, building a timeline of exactly what Coach Miller had done and when. The footage was damning. Hours of practice where I clearly outperformed Chad, followed by Miller's editing sessions where he erased me from the record. In one video, you could see him pause on a clip of me hitting 5 straight threes, watch it twice, then delete it and replace it with Chad making one contested jumper. The care he took in building this lie was almost impressive. He wasn't just favoring his nephew. He was constructing an alternate reality where Chad was the talent and I was the problem. But I couldn't go to anyone yet. Miller had already painted me as bitter and jealous. If I came forward now with accusations, people would think I was making excuses. I needed more. I needed him to say it out loud, admit what he was doing, and why. So I started going to the gym on my own, early mornings before school when nobody else was there. I'd shoot for an hour, work on my handles, run through drills that kept my body sharp while my mind planned. I bought a small voice recorder from the electronics store, the kind journalists use, and kept it in my backpack. I didn't know exactly when I'd need it, but I knew the opportunity would come. It came on a Thursday. I was in the library during lunch when I overheard 2 freshman girls talking about Chad, how he was so good, how he was definitely going to get recruited. They were looking at the basketball team's Instagram, scrolling through highlight clips. I walked over, casual, asked if I could see. They showed me. The account had been posting Chad content nonstop, building his profile like he was already a star. Every post had comments from local news accounts, basketball fan pages, even a few small college programs showing interest. Miller was using the school's platform to promote his nephew while I sat suspended. I went to practice that afternoon, even though I wasn't supposed to. Stood outside the gym with my recorder running, just listening. Most of it was normal practice noise. Whistles, squeaking shoes, Miller calling out instructions. Then practice ended and I heard the team leave. I waited. 5 minutes later, voices again. Just Miller and Chad. I pressed closer to the door, recorder held up. Chad was complaining about a teammate not passing him the ball enough. Miller's response made my chest tight. He said not to worry, that he'd talked to the kid, that everything was being set up for Chad to shine. Then he said he needed Chad to succeed because it was about family legacy, about proving the Miller name meant something in basketball. Chad asked what about Darius, didn't people notice? Miller laughed, actually laughed, and said I was being handled, that by the time anyone figured out what was happening, Chad would have offers and I'd be forgotten. Said he'd made sure the right people saw the right footage. Said suspension would keep me quiet long enough for the narrative to set. I stood there in the hallway, recorder running, hands shaking with rage and vindication. This was it. This was everything. I had him admitting to fraud, to manipulation, to deliberately sabotaging my future for his nephew's benefit. The conversation kept going, but I'd heard enough. I walked out of the school and sat in my car, playing the recording back 3 times to make sure it was clear. It was. Every word, every detail, captured perfectly. I had video evidence of the editing, audio evidence of the confession, and a timeline that proved intent. The question now was who to take it to. The athletic director was Miller's friend. They'd coached together for years. The principal was overwhelmed and barely paid attention to sports. I needed someone who'd actually care, who'd see this for what it was. I thought about the media, about sending everything to the local news, but that felt messy, hard to control. Then I remembered the school board meeting next Tuesday. They were reviewing athletic department budgets, and public comment was open. Anyone could sign up to speak. I pulled up the district website and registered to address the board, listing my topic as concerns about basketball program integrity. The confirmation email came through immediately. I had 5 days to prepare, 5 days to build my case so airtight that Miller couldn't talk his way out. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Power. Not the angry, desperate kind, but the cold, calculated kind that comes from knowing you're right and having proof. That night, I organized everything into a presentation. Timeline on one document, video clips saved and labeled, audio file cleaned up, and time-stamped. I practiced what I'd say, kept it factual and calm, no emotion, just evidence. My mother came home late and found me still working at the kitchen table. She asked what I was doing, and I told her the truth. I was fighting back. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, said she'd take off work Tuesday to come with me. I didn't sleep much that weekend, but it wasn't from worry, it was from anticipation. I started recording every practice with my phone hidden in my bag, positioned where it could capture the gym while looking like I'd just left it there. I wasn't suspended from school, just from practicing with the team, so I'd show up to the gym during their sessions and sit in the bleachers doing homework, making it look like I was just there because I had nowhere else to go. Coach Miller hated it. I could see the tension in his shoulders every time he glanced up and saw me there, but he couldn't kick me out of a public space during school hours. So I sat, and my phone recorded, and I collected more evidence of the slow erasure happening on that court. Chad started getting bolder. One afternoon he walked past me during a water break and said loud enough for everyone to hear that I should try out for the junior varsity team next year. Maybe I'd make second string. His friends laughed, and a few of my former teammates looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet. I didn't respond, didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I just pulled out my notebook and wrote down the time and what he'd said. He called me a weirdo and walked away. The phone in my bag caught all of it. His voice, the laughter, the silence from everyone else. More evidence of the environment Miller had created. The practices I recorded showed the same pattern repeating. Chad would run a drill, mess up, get encouraging feedback. When a teammate made the same mistake, Miller would snap at them, make them run laps. The favoritism was so obvious I wondered how no one was calling it out. But I understood. Miller was the coach, the authority figure, the man who decided who played and who sat. Nobody wanted to risk their own playing time by questioning him. So they went along with it, and Chad got worse at basketball while thinking he was getting better, and I sat in the bleachers building a case. Tuesday came. I wore a button-down shirt and slacks, the same outfit I'd worn to my college interview with Oregon back when that still mattered. My mother drove us to the district office where the school board met, a bland administrative building that smelled like old carpet and copy paper. We signed in at the front desk and were directed to a conference room with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. A few other people were there, mostly parents with various complaints, and we took seats in the back. I had my laptop in a bag, had double-checked that all my files were loaded and ready, had practiced my statement enough times that I could deliver it in my sleep. The board meeting started with budget reports and policy reviews, boring administrative stuff that made my leg bounce with nervous energy. My mother put her hand on my knee to steady me. Finally, 90 minutes in, they opened the floor for public comment. 3 people went before me, someone complaining about parking, someone proposing a new recycling program, someone asking about special education funding. Each got 5 minutes. Then they called my name. I walked to the podium at the front of the room, set up my laptop, and looked at the 7 board members staring back at me with polite, tired expressions. I introduced myself, stated that I was a senior at Roosevelt High and had concerns about ethical violations in the basketball program. That got their attention. Backs straightened, a couple of them glanced at each other. I pulled up my timeline and started walking through it. Explained how I'd been benched without cause, how my game footage had been used in someone else's highlight reels, how I'd been suspended for questioning it. I kept my voice steady, factual, no anger. Then I played the video clips, side-by-side comparisons of practice footage and edited highlights, making it impossible to deny what had been done. The room got very quiet. Then I played the audio. Coach Miller's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, talking about setting everything up for Chad to shine, about making sure I was handled, about family legacy and proving the Miller name. I watched the board members' faces change as they listened. Shock, then discomfort, then something like anger. When the recording ended, I closed my laptop and said simply that I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for fairness. That I'd worked for 3 years to earn my spot and had it taken not because I wasn't good enough, but because I wasn't related to the right person. Then I thanked them for their time and sat down. The room stayed silent for a moment. Then the board president, a thin woman in her 50s named Dr. Hayes, asked if anyone from the athletic department was present. Nobody was. They hadn't thought they'd need to be at a budget meeting. Dr. Hayes said they'd be launching an immediate investigation and would contact me for additional information. The meeting moved on to other business, but I could feel the shift in the room. People were whispering, looking at me, at my mother. We left before the meeting ended, and in the parking lot my mother hugged me tight. She said she was proud of me for speaking up. I felt lighter walking to the car than I had in months. But I knew Miller would find out by tomorrow, and I had no idea how he'd react. Coach Miller found out before I even made it to school the next morning. My phone started buzzing at 7 with texts from Jerome. The principal had called an emergency meeting with Miller and the athletic director, and people were talking about the school board recording already being shared around the district office. By the time I walked through the front doors, everyone was staring at me like I'd set off a bomb. Some looks were supportive, mostly from kids who'd never liked Miller. Others were hostile, like I'd betrayed some unspoken code by going public. I kept my head up and walked to my locker, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. Second period, I got called to the principal's office. My stomach dropped, but I grabbed my bag and went. Principal Vasquez was waiting with Athletic Director Morrison and Coach Miller. Miller looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight, face red, jaw tight, hands gripping the arms of his chair. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Vasquez gestured for me to sit. She said they'd heard my presentation to the school board and wanted to give Coach Miller an opportunity to respond to the allegations. I said that was fine. I stood by everything I'd presented. Miller leaned forward and started talking, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. He said I'd doctored the footage, that I'd manipulated audio files to make it sound like he'd said things he hadn't. Said I was a troubled kid with resentment issues who couldn't handle losing my starting position fairly. Said he'd tried to help me work through my attitude problems, but I'd responded with lies and defamation. Morrison nodded along, backing him up, saying they'd reviewed my claims and found them inconsistent with the coach's records. I felt the ground shift again. They were closing ranks, protecting their own. I asked if they'd actually watched the full practice videos or just listened to Miller's explanation. Vasquez said the investigation was ongoing, but they had concerns about my credibility. Then she hit me with it. I was being suspended from school pending the investigation's conclusion. Not Miller, who'd committed fraud and admitted it on tape. Me, for bringing evidence of fraud to the school board. The reasoning was that I'd created a hostile environment, and they needed to separate parties while they reviewed the situation. I asked how long the suspension would be. She said probably 2 weeks, maybe longer depending on what they found. 2 weeks meant I'd miss senior night, the biggest game of the season, the last chance for any scouts to see me play. I looked at Miller and saw the smallest hint of satisfaction in his eyes. He'd won again. I left the office feeling crushed. The suspension was effective immediately. I had to clear out my locker and leave campus within the hour. I grabbed my things in a daze, ignoring the stares and whispers. Jerome caught me in the hallway and asked what happened. I told him they'd called me a liar and suspended me. He looked furious, said that was wrong, that everyone knew Miller was dirty, but nobody was going to risk saying it out loud. Not if this was what happened to people who did. I walked out of Roosevelt High at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, carrying a box of my stuff, and sat in my car trying not to break down. My mother came home early when I called her. She listened to everything, then got on the phone with a lawyer she knew from the hospital. They talked for 20 minutes while I sat at the kitchen table, numb. When she hung up, she said we could fight the suspension, but it would take time. Probably wouldn't be resolved before senior night. The lawyer also said going after Miller directly would be hard. The audio could be called hearsay. The video evidence could be questioned. Schools protected their employees, especially in small towns where everyone knew everyone. Our best bet was to keep pushing the school board investigation and hope they did the right thing. That night, lying in bed, I saw the local newspaper had published a headline, "Student suspended after allegations against coach." The article was short and mostly quoted Vasquez saying they took all accusations seriously but had to protect the integrity of the investigation. Miller wasn't named. I wasn't either, technically, but everyone in town knew who they were talking about. The comments section was split, half saying I was brave for speaking up, half calling me a whiner who couldn't handle competition. I closed my laptop and stared at the ceiling, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. The investigation I'd hoped would clear my name was being used to silence me instead. Senior night was in 8 days, and I was suspended, benched, and erased. Miller had turned my truth into his weapon. The first few days of suspension felt like drowning in slow motion. I'd wake up at my normal time, then remember I had nowhere to go. My routine was gone. No classes, no practice, no structure to hold on to. I spent hours in my room, alternating between rage and despair, checking my email obsessively for updates from the school board that never came. The investigation they'd promised felt like a black hole, swallowing evidence and producing nothing. My mother tried to keep my spirits up, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at me. She was working extra shifts to cover bills, and now her son's future was imploding in real time. Jerome texted me updates from school. Chad was starting every game now. The team was struggling without me running the offense. Miller was more aggressive than ever in practice. Nobody was talking about the allegations publicly, but privately, everyone knew something was wrong. A few teammates reached out with half-hearted messages of support, but mostly I was treated like I'd disappeared. Out of sight, out of mind. The world kept spinning without me in it. I spent a lot of time on the couch, staring at nothing, wondering if fighting back had been worth it or if I'd just made everything worse. 5 days into suspension, my mother came home from work and found me in the same spot I'd been in that morning, still in the same clothes. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with that expression mothers have when they're disappointed but trying not to show it. Then she sat down next to me and said something I'd heard before but hadn't really listened to. You don't fight lies with silence. She reminded me that I had proof, that I'd done nothing wrong, that hiding in the house wasn't going to change anyone's mind. She said if the school board and the principal wouldn't listen, maybe other people would. I asked her what she meant. She said the internet was a big place, and truth had a way of spreading when people actually saw it. I understood immediately. She was suggesting I go public, beyond the school board, beyond the official channels that had failed me. Post the evidence online. Let people see for themselves what Miller had done. It felt risky. Felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But what did I have to lose at this point? My scholarship prospects were dead. My senior season was over. My reputation was already destroyed by Miller's lies. At least this way, people would know why. That night, I created an anonymous YouTube account and uploaded a video. Nothing fancy, just a title screen that said, "The Truth About Roosevelt High Basketball," then 15 minutes of side-by-side footage showing practice reality versus edited highlights, showing me making plays that got credited to Chad, showing Miller cutting my best moments and splicing in his nephew's mediocre ones. I included the audio recording of Miller talking about family legacy and making sure I was handled. At the end, I added a simple text overlay. This is what happens when nepotism matters more than merit. Then I hit publish and closed my laptop. I didn't expect anything to happen immediately. Figured maybe a few hundred people would watch it, mostly students from my school, and that would be that. I went to bed around midnight and slept better than I had in weeks, just from having done something instead of sitting in paralysis. When I woke up the next morning and checked my phone, the video had 40,000 views. My heart stopped. I refreshed the page. 50,000. Comments were pouring in, people sharing it on Twitter and Facebook, tagging local news stations and sports blogs. The story was spreading faster than I could track. By noon, the video had 200,000 views. News outlets started calling our house. My mother had to unplug the landline. My email inbox exploded with messages from reporters, from other athletes with similar stories, from college coaches saying they'd heard what happened and wanted to help. The local TV station sent a crew to our house asking for an interview. I gave them one, sitting on our front porch telling the whole story from beginning to end on camera. That interview got picked up by regional news, then by ESPN's high school sports segment. By evening, Roosevelt High basketball scandal was trending on social media. The town erupted. Parents were calling for Miller's firing. Alumni were demanding investigations. Reporters were camped outside the school, trying to get statements from administrators who suddenly had nothing to say. I watched it all unfold from my living room, feeling a mix of vindication and terror. I'd wanted people to see the truth, and now millions of people were seeing it. The question was whether it would actually change anything, or if Miller would find a way to spin this too. My phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. I opened it and felt my heart jump. It was from a scout at a nearby Division II college saying they'd seen everything and wanted to talk. The next morning, Roosevelt High looked like a crime scene. News vans lined the street, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the school entrance, parents gathering in angry clusters on the lawn. I watched it on the local news from my couch, saw Principal Vasquez trying to push through the crowd while ignoring shouted questions. The district office released a statement saying they were deeply concerned by the video and were expediting their investigation, which was bureaucratic speak for panic. Alumni started a petition demanding Miller's immediate termination. It got 5,000 signatures in 6 hours. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting for Thursday night. Students were posting their own stories online, talking about other times Miller had played favorites, other players he'd benched without cause, other instances where talent got buried under nepotism. A sophomore named Marcus posted footage from JV games last year where the same thing had happened. Miller's other nephew, Chad's younger brother, getting minutes he hadn't earned while better players sat. The pattern was undeniable. What I thought was personal turned out to be part of a system Miller had been running for years. My case was just the one that finally got documented. Coach Miller tried to control the damage. He posted a statement on the school's athletic page saying the video was selectively edited and taken out of context, that he'd always prioritized team success over individual glory. Nobody believed him. The comment section filled with people calling him a liar, a fraud, a disgrace to coaching. He deleted the post within an hour, which only made things worse. Screenshots had already spread everywhere. His reputation was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I watched it happen with a strange detachment, like I was witnessing something inevitable that had been building for years. Chad stopped posting on social media entirely. His Instagram went private. His Twitter went dark. Word from Jerome was that he'd stopped coming to school, that his parents had pulled him out temporarily while things settled down. I almost felt bad for him. He was just a kid who'd been handed opportunities he hadn't earned, told he was special when he was average. Miller had done this to him too, in a different way. Set him up for a fall he never saw coming. But my sympathy only went so far. Chad had been cruel when he had power, had mocked me in front of everyone. Actions had consequences even for nephews. Thursday night, the school board meeting was packed. They'd moved it to the high school auditorium to accommodate the crowd. Had to be 300 people there, maybe more. News cameras lined the back wall. My mother and I sat in the middle section, surrounded by parents and students and community members who'd never cared about basketball before but cared about fairness. The board looked overwhelmed. 7 regular people who'd signed up to review budgets and approve textbook orders now facing a full-blown scandal. Dr. Hayes called the meeting to order, and the room went silent. They'd completed their investigation in 72 hours, record time for bureaucracy, which told you how much pressure they were under. Dr. Hayes read the findings in a flat, professional voice. They'd verified that game footage had been misappropriated, that highlight reels had been edited to misrepresent player performance, that disciplinary actions had been applied inconsistently. They'd interviewed Coach Miller, who'd admitted to judgment errors but denied intentional wrongdoing. They'd reviewed the audio recording and confirmed it was authentic and unaltered. The conclusion was clear. Miller had violated district ethics policies and athletic department guidelines. The board voted unanimously to terminate his employment effective immediately. The room erupted in applause and shouts. Miller wasn't there to hear it. He'd apparently resigned that morning, just hours before they could fire him. It didn't matter. The result was the same. He was gone. Athletic Director Morrison was placed on administrative leave pending a separate review of his role in covering up the violations. Vasquez made a public apology to me specifically, saying I should never have been suspended and would be reinstated immediately with the record expunged. She said senior night was tomorrow, and I was welcome to play if I wanted to. I sat there, absorbing it all, feeling something like justice, but not quite satisfaction. Miller was gone, but the damage he'd done was real. I'd lost weeks of my senior season, lost recruiting opportunities that weren't coming back, lost time I could never recover. Still, people had listened. The truth had mattered. That counted for something. The meeting continued with discussions about interim coaching and policy reforms, but I stopped paying attention. My mother squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. We left before it ended, walking out into the cold February night. My phone buzzed in the parking lot. It was a direct message on Instagram from a scout named Coach Williams from Oregon State. He said he'd been following the story, wanted to know if I'd be interested in talking about opportunities. He said they valued character and resilience as much as talent, and I'd shown both. Senior night came fast. I barely had time to process everything that had happened before I was back in the gym, back in my jersey, back in a world that felt familiar but completely different. The school had hired an interim coach, Coach Thompson, who'd been an assistant at a nearby college and agreed to finish out the season. He called me the day before the game, said he'd watched all my film, the real film, and knew what kind of player I was. Said I'd be starting point guard like I should have been all along. Hearing that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for months. The gym was packed for senior night, more crowded than I'd ever seen it. People weren't just there for basketball. They were there because the story had blown up, because everyone wanted to see what happened next, because this game meant something beyond points and wins. News cameras were set up in the corner. Scouts I'd never seen before sat in the stands with clipboards. My teammates were different too. Looser, more energized, like a weight had been lifted. Jerome dapped me up in the locker room and said it was good to have me back. A few other guys apologized for staying quiet when things got bad. I told them I understood, and I meant it. The ceremony started with the usual senior night traditions. They introduced each senior one by one, walking out with their families for photos and applause. When they called my name, the gym exploded. People stood up, cheering so loud I couldn't hear the announcer finish. I walked out with my mother and Nia, both of them dressed up, both of them crying happy tears. The ovation lasted almost a minute. I looked up at the crowd and saw students holding signs that said, "Justice for Darius," and "Real talent can't be benched." My throat got tight, but I kept it together. Chad wasn't there. His whole family stayed away. I didn't blame them. Showing up would have been impossible after everything. Part of me wished things had been different, that Miller had just coached fairly and let the best players play. But wishing didn't change what happened. The ceremony finished and we huddled up before tip-off. Coach Thompson kept it simple, told us to play our game, trust each other, leave everything on the court. He looked at me when he said it, and I nodded. This was what I'd been waiting for. Not just to play, but to prove that everything I'd fought for was real. The game started, and it felt like I'd never left. First possession, I brought the ball up court and everything slowed down. The defender played me tight, trying to force me left. I crossed over right, accelerated past him, drew the help defense and kicked it to Jerome in the corner. He knocked down the three. The crowd roared. Next possession, I ran the pick and roll, found our big man rolling to the basket for an easy dunk. We were up 5 before the other team called timeout. Everything was clicking. Passes were crisp, defensive rotations were sharp. The chemistry we'd been missing all season suddenly appeared. By halftime, we were up 12 and I had 14 points and 6 assists. The locker room was electric, everyone talking and laughing, believing we could actually win this thing. Coach Thompson told us to stay focused, that the other team would make a run, and we needed to respond with poise. He was right. They came out aggressive in the third quarter, pressing full court and hitting tough shots. They cut the lead to 4 with 8 minutes left in the game. The gym got tense. I called everyone together during a timeout, told them we'd been through worse than a little adversity. We broke the huddle and went back to work. Fourth quarter, I took over. Not in a selfish way, but in the way point guards are supposed to when the game is on the line. Making the right read every time, keeping everyone involved, scoring when we needed a bucket. With 3 minutes left, I hit a step-back 3 to put us up 7. With a minute left, I drove and dished to Jerome for a layup that sealed it. When the final buzzer sounded, we'd won by 11 and the gym erupted. My teammates mobbed me at center court, everyone screaming and jumping. I finished with 28 points and 11 assists. The celebration felt earned, felt right. After all the injustice and frustration, we'd won on senior night with me running the show like I was always supposed to. When things finally calmed down, I saw Coach Williams standing near the exit, the scout from Oregon State who'd messaged me. He walked over, shook my hand, said he'd seen enough, said he wanted to talk seriously about me joining his program next year. It wasn't UCLA or Oregon, but it was something real, something I'd earned. That's when I saw his name on the scholarship offer he handed me. Full ride, 4 years, all expenses covered. The scholarship offer from Coach Williams felt like holding proof that the world could still be fair. I read it 3 times in the locker room after everyone had left, making sure it was real. Full athletic scholarship to Oregon State, renewable for 4 years based on academic standing and athletic performance. Everything covered: tuition, room, board, books. My mother had come down from the stands and was waiting outside. When I showed her the letter, she burst into tears right there in the hallway. Not sad tears, relief tears, joy tears, the kind that come when months of pressure finally release. We drove home in silence, but it was a good silence. Nia sat in the back seat reading the scholarship letter over and over, asking questions about Oregon and whether she could visit me at college. I told her of course she could, that once I got settled she'd come out and see the campus, maybe catch a game. My mother kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on my shoulder, like she needed to touch me to believe this was happening. When we pulled into our driveway, she turned to me and said she was proud, not just of the scholarship, but of how I'd fought for the truth, even when it cost me everything. School, the next week, felt different. Word had spread about the Oregon State offer, and suddenly people treated me like I'd already made it. Teachers congratulated me in class. Students I barely knew stopped me in the hallways to say good job. Even Principal Vasquez called me into her office to personally apologize for how the school had handled everything. She said they were implementing new policies to prevent coaching misconduct, that my case had exposed serious flaws in their system. I appreciated it, but apologies didn't give me back the time I'd lost or the opportunities that had closed. Jerome and I were sitting in the cafeteria when Chad walked in. First time I'd seen him since the scandal broke. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, eyes down. He grabbed his lunch and headed for a table in the corner by himself. A few people stared, whispered, but mostly everyone ignored him. Jerome asked if I felt bad for him. I thought about it. Told him I felt bad for the kid Chad could have been if his uncle hadn't tried to shortcut his development. But I didn't feel responsible for what happened to him. He'd been cruel when he had power, and now he was learning what powerlessness felt like. The final weeks of school passed in a blur. Playoffs, prom, graduation preparations. We made it to the state semifinals before losing to a team that was just better than us. I played well, averaged 25 points and 9 assists through the playoff run. But it wasn't about stats anymore. It was about proving I belonged, about showing everyone who doubted me that talent couldn't be buried forever. Scouts from other schools reached out after seeing the playoff games, but I was committed to Oregon State. Coach Williams had given me a chance when nobody else would, and I didn't forget things like that. Graduation day came with perfect weather, sunny, warm, everything you'd want for a ceremony celebrating the end of high school. I sat with my class in those uncomfortable folding chairs listening to speeches about the future and following your dreams. When they called my name to receive my diploma, the crowd cheered loud. Not as loud as senior night, but loud enough that I felt appreciated. My mother and Nia were in the stands, both of them taking pictures on their phones, both of them smiling wider than I'd seen in years. I walked across that stage knowing I'd earned this moment, not just the diploma, but everything it represented. After the ceremony, there was a small reception where families took photos and said goodbye to teachers. I was standing with my mother when Coach Miller appeared. He'd been avoiding the school since his termination, but apparently he'd come to graduation to see some of his former players walk. When he saw me, he stopped, and for a moment I thought he'd turn around and leave. Instead, he walked over. My mother tensed beside me, but I put a hand on her arm, told her it was okay. Miller looked older than I remembered, worn down by what had happened. He didn't offer his hand, just stood there a respectful distance away. He said he'd heard about the scholarship, said he was glad things had worked out for me. His voice was quiet, sincere. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said I'd been the best player he'd ever coached, and he was sorry he'd let family loyalty blind him to that. Said he'd made a terrible mistake and would regret it for the rest of his life. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to decide how to respond. I told him I accepted his apology, but that some damage couldn't be undone. That the weeks I'd lost, the opportunities that had closed, the trust that had been broken, those things were permanent. But I also said I'd learned from what happened, that it had made me stronger and more careful about who I trusted. Then I turned and walked away with my mother, leaving Miller standing there alone in the crowd. I didn't look back. Summer before college passed quick. I worked at a community center running basketball camps for kids, saved money for expenses Oregon State wouldn't cover, spent time with my mother and Nia knowing I'd be gone soon. Jerome got accepted to a school about 2 hours from where I'd be, said we'd still link up on weekends. The whole experience of leaving felt bittersweet, excited for what was coming but sad about what I was leaving behind. The town that had witnessed my worst moment was also the place that had raised me, and I'd always carry both. In August, my mother drove me to Oregon. 15-hour drive, split over 2 days, the Camry packed with everything I owned. We didn't talk much during the drive, just listened to music and watched the landscape change from familiar to foreign. When we finally pulled onto the Oregon State campus, I felt my stomach flip. This was real now. Not a scholarship letter or a dream, but actual college, actual basketball at the next level. My mother helped me move into the dorms, met my roommate, arranged my small space into something that felt like home. Before she left, she hugged me tight and whispered that she loved me, that she believed in me, that everything I'd been through had prepared me for this. The basketball program at Oregon State was professional, intense, nothing like high school. Coach Williams ran practices that were longer and harder than anything I'd experienced. The other players were good, guys who'd been stars at their own schools, who'd never been benched or doubted. I had to earn my spot all over again, prove I belonged at this level. The first few weeks were brutal. I was slower than some guys, smaller than others, adjusting to a pace and physicality that high school hadn't prepared me for. But I'd been through worse. I'd been erased and suspended and had my future stolen. This was just basketball. I could handle basketball. By mid-season, I'd worked my way into the rotation. Not starting yet, but getting real minutes. Contributing. Coach Williams pulled me aside after a game where I'd played well and said he saw growth, saw potential, saw the same resilience that had impressed him when he first watched me play. Said if I kept working, kept improving, I could be starting by sophomore year. That was enough for me. I wasn't trying to be perfect or prove anything to anyone except myself. Just wanted to keep getting better, keep earning my opportunities, keep showing that talent and work mattered more than connections. Midway through my freshman year, I got a message on social media from someone I hadn't thought about in months, Chad Miller. He'd transferred to a school across the state, was playing JV basketball there, said he wanted to apologize for how he'd acted. His message was long, detailed, talking about how his uncle had put pressure on him to succeed, how he'd let that pressure turn him into someone he wasn't proud of. He said watching everything fall apart had forced him to look at himself, and he didn't like what he saw. Said he was working on being better, being honest, being someone who earned things instead of having them handed over. I read the message twice, thought about responding, decided to let it sit for a day. Part of me wanted to ignore it, leave that chapter closed. Part of me appreciated the honesty, recognized that Chad had been a kid caught in his uncle's scheme just like I had been. Finally, I wrote back, told him I appreciated the apology, that I understood family pressure could mess you up, that I hoped he figured things out. But I also told him we probably wouldn't be friends, that too much had happened for things to be normal between us. He responded saying he understood, that he just wanted me to know he was sorry. That was the last time we talked. Spring semester, Oregon State made it to the conference tournament. I was getting regular minutes by then, playing solid defense and running the offense when the starters needed rest. We didn't win the tournament, but we competed, showed we belonged. After the season ended, Coach Williams called me into his office and said he was pleased with my development, said next year I'd be competing for a starting spot, that he saw me as a leader on the team moving forward. Coming from him, from someone who'd believed in me when my stock was at its lowest, those words meant everything. Summer after freshman year, I went home to visit. The town looked the same but felt different. Roosevelt High had a new basketball coach, someone from outside the district with no family connections. The program was rebuilding, trying to establish credibility after the scandal. Jerome was home too, and we spent a few days catching up, talking about college, about how far we'd come from where we'd been a year ago. He said people still talked about what had happened, about how I'd stood up to Miller and won. Said some kids at the school looked at me like proof that speaking up was worth it. One afternoon, Jerome and I went to shoot at the outdoor courts where we'd played as kids. The rims were bent, the concrete was cracked, but it was home. We ran pickup games with neighborhood kids, just playing for fun, no pressure, no scouts, no stakes. Somewhere between those games and those conversations, I realized I'd made it through, not just survived what happened, but actually made it to the other side. I had a scholarship, a future, a story I could tell without shame. The anger I'd carried for months had faded into something quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Coach Williams called me midsummer with news. I'd be starting point guard next season. The signing ceremony happened at the start of my sophomore year, a formal event where the team gathered for photos and the athletic department announced the roster. When Coach Williams introduced the starters and called my name first, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ego. This wasn't given to me because of who I knew or who my family was. This was earned through hours in the gym, through film study, through proving myself every single practice. The applause from my teammates felt genuine, and for the first time since the Miller situation, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The season started strong. We won our first 5 games, and I was running the offense like Coach Williams had envisioned, distributing the ball, making smart decisions, playing defense that frustrated opposing guards. Local media started covering our games more, and my name came up in articles about breakout players in the conference. A reporter from the student newspaper wanted to do a feature on my journey, asked about the high school scandal that had almost derailed everything. I agreed to the interview, figured it was time to tell the full story now that I had some distance from it. The article published with the headline, "From Benched to Starting, Darius Carter's Road to Redemption." They included everything: Miller's nepotism, the stolen highlights, the viral video, the vindication. But they also focused on the aftermath, on how I'd chosen Oregon State because Coach Williams had shown faith when others hadn't, on how adversity had shaped my character as much as my game. The story got picked up by larger outlets, shared on social media, and suddenly I was getting messages from athletes all over the country who'd faced similar situations. Kids who'd been benched unfairly, overlooked because of politics, pushed aside for someone with connections. I started responding to those messages when I had time, told them to document everything, to speak up through proper channels, to never let anyone erase their truth. Told them it might cost something in the short term, but staying silent cost more in the long run. Some of them thanked me, said I'd given them courage. Others said they'd tried speaking up and it hadn't worked, that the systems protected the powerful. I understood that too. I'd been lucky that the evidence was so clear, that the story went viral, that public pressure forced accountability. Not everyone would get that same outcome. Mid-season, we played a tournament in California, and I had the best game of my college career. 32 points, 10 assists, no turnovers and a win against a ranked opponent. Scouts from NBA teams were in attendance, not there for me specifically, but watching nonetheless. After the game, one of them came up and introduced himself, said he'd been following my story, said I had the kind of mentality that translated to professional basketball. He handed me his card, told me to keep working. I knew I wasn't NBA ready yet, might never be, but the fact that someone at that level saw potential meant I was on the right path. Coach Williams pulled me aside during practice the next week and had a conversation that changed my perspective. He said basketball was temporary, that even if I made it to the pros, I'd only play for a few years before my body gave out. But the lessons I'd learned about integrity, about fighting for what's right, about resilience, those would last forever. He said I had a platform now, a story that resonated with people, and I should think about how to use it beyond just playing games. The conversation stuck with me, made me think about what came after basketball, about legacy and purpose. I started a video series on social media about my journey. Nothing fancy, just me talking to the camera about what I'd learned, about recognizing when systems are unfair, about the cost of speaking truth to power, about finding allies and building evidence and staying strong when everyone doubts you. The videos got decent views, mostly from high school athletes and parents, people who appreciated hearing from someone who'd been through it. I wasn't trying to be an influencer or a motivational speaker, just wanted to share what I'd learned so maybe someone else's fight would be a little easier. End of season, we made it to the conference finals, lost in overtime to a team that went on to the NCAA tournament, but we'd exceeded expectations. I finished averaging 18 points and 7 assists, made second team all-conference, got named to the conference all-defensive team. The individual accolades felt good, but what felt better was knowing I'd helped build something, a winning culture, a team identity, a program that people respected. Coach Williams said next year we'd be favorites to win the conference, that with our core returning as juniors, we had everything we needed. Summer, after sophomore year, I got an email from the school board back in my hometown. Dr. Hayes, the board president who'd investigated Miller, said they were implementing new ethics policies for all athletic programs in the district. She asked if I'd be willing to speak at a training session for coaches about the importance of fairness and integrity. I said yes, flew back home for a day, stood in front of 40 coaches, and told them my story. Told them about the damage Miller had done, about how one corrupt coach could destroy a kid's future, about why accountability mattered. At the end of my presentation, I looked out at those coaches and said something I'd been thinking about for a long time, that coaching was about developing young people, not advancing personal agendas, and if they couldn't keep that straight, they needed to find a different profession. The room was silent when I finished. Then they stood up, all 40 of them, and applauded. Dr. Hayes thanked me afterward, said my willingness to share my story was helping create real change. I told her change was good, but it had come too late for me and all the other players Miller had buried over the years. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Darius Carter's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.